A squad car stopped him in a car on the bridge to Malmö, covered in blood, babbling like a lunatic. The Nazis seized Minnelunden when they took control of the neighbouring Roewegen barracks in 1943 as their grip on Copenhagen tightened. In the army buildings across the railway line, they established a command centre. Here, on the flat land once used for parades and exercises, they walked partisan prisoners to the pistol firing range and shot them. Madsen stamped his feet on the paving stones and blew on his hands. "I guess that means half the job's done." Brix just looked at him. "The husband," the young officer repeated with obvious impatience. "He's covered in blood." 2 years before, when, half-knowingly, they were stumbling towards divorce, Brix had shown his wife round Minnelunden. It was a futile effort to interest her in his native city, to keep her from flying home for good. She came from London, which meant she never fully grasped the context of the place. You needed to be Danish, brought here dutifully by a stern-faced parent for that. The English knew the meaning of war, but were naively, dangerously ignorant of the nature of occupation. For them, for the Americans too, conflicts happened in other places, broke out like remote wildfires, then were stamped into cinders and ashes that stayed in foreign lands. It was different for the Danes in a way he could never explain. They had fought as best they could when the Germans rolled into Jutland in 1940, then, for a while, quietly acquiesced in return for a semblance of normality, of sham independence in a Europe torn apart by war, a fresh, cruel landscape which the Nazis seemed destined to master. By the time Jews began to disappear and daring bands of partisans started to prick consciences, attitudes were changing. Some fought back, paying the ultimate cost, tortured in cells in the Politigon, the police headquarters where Brix now worked, then driven to Minnelunden, tied to a stake in the ground against a grassy rampart made for targets that were not human, did not breathe. He could still hear his father describing the scene in May 1945 when liberation came. The Germans had rushed to murder as many captives as they could in those closing months. Broken, rotting corpses lay half-buried in the bare fields, abandoned in the rush. They didn't die easily, and nor did the experience of occupation. That mixture of rage and grief and a secret sense of shame still lingered. As a child, shivering in front of those 3 stakes, preserved as memorials before the grassy ramp of the firing range, Lennart Brix had wondered, would he have had such courage, or turned away and lived instead? It was a question everyone who followed was bound to ask, but rarely out loud. The bark of a dog broke his reverie. Brix looked at the forensic officers, white bunny suits, mob hats, marching grim-faced down the rows of graves towards the space in the little wood where the rest of the team was gathering. Perhaps, he thought, that moment 50 years before had marked him out as a detective, someone who looked for reasons when none seemed easily available. "Boss?" Madsen's face was full of the prurient enthusiasm he expected of his men. They had to have the hunger, the need for the chase. Detectives were hunters, all of them. Some better than others, though the best he'd ever encountered was now wasting her life and her talents inside a border guard's uniform in a godforsaken corner of Zealand. Brix didn't answer. He strode ahead, knowing this had to be faced. A flat rectangle of grass, muddy from the tramping of police boots, banks raised on 3 sides, tallest at the narrow end. The floodlights were so bright it seemed a full moon had come to hover above them. Beyond their reach, more men were starting to search patiently through the surrounding area, torches high in their hands. 3 gnarled stakes, replicas now, with the originals in the small resistance museum in the city, the Frihetsmuseet. A woman was tied to the centre pole, hands behind her back, bound with heavy rope round her torso. Blonde hair soaked with rain and worse.